The buzzing neon lights of the city's nightlife flickered outside the Scarlet Room, casting an alluring glow over its entrance. For David, a quiet young man in his mid-20s, it was a decision made on impulse. He had always followed the straight and narrow path, largely due to his father, Detective Carson, a man respected and feared in equal measure. As he stepped inside, the air was thick with laughter and the faint scent of whiskey and cigarette smoke. David felt out of place among the laughter and rowdy chatter, but something pulled him deeper into the bar. He settled onto a stool, tapping his fingers nervously against the polished wood. "Another drink?" A smooth voice broke through his thoughts. David turned to find Lena, the bartender, standing before him. Her dark hair framed her sharp features, and her eyes sparkled with mischief and mystery. David was captivated. Sure," he stammered, his usual composure slipping away. Lena poured his drink with practiced ease, her gaze flitting to a group of men huddled in the corner, their eyes lingering on her in a way that made David uneasy. "Rough night?" Lena asked, leaning against the bar, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart race. "Just needed to escape for a bit," David admitted, trying to sound casual. "Many come here looking for an escape," she replied with a knowing smile, "but sometimes they find more than they bargained for." David couldn't help but chuckle. "Is that a warning?" "Call it a friendly piece of advice," Lena said, her lips curling into a playful grin. Yet something about her expression hinted at a deeper story, one she wasn't ready to share. Days turned into weeks, and David found himself returning to the Scarlet Room night after night. Each time, he felt a magnetic pull toward Lena. She was more than just a bartender. There was an air of mystery that surrounded her, a hint of danger that intrigued him. One evening, as they shared a quieter moment after the bar closed, Lena opened up a little. "I came to this city to make a fresh start," she said, her voice softer than usual. "But it's harder than I thought." "What do you mean?" David asked, genuinely interested. "Life can get complicated," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "But it's nothing I can't handle." The conversation left David unsettled. There were gaps in her story, secrets that felt too heavy to bear. But he didn't push. He respected her privacy, even as his feelings for her deepened. What David didn't know was that Lena was living a life far more complicated than he could imagine. She wasn't just a bartender. She was an undercover agent for a powerful mafia boss, tasked with gathering intelligence. As their connection grew, so did the danger surrounding them. The threads of their lives were beginning to intertwine, drawing David into a world filled with secrets and deception. The Scarlet Room had become a second home for David, a sanctuary where he could escape the weight of his father's expectations and the looming shadow of his police work. Each night, he found himself drawn to Lena more than ever, captivated by her presence and the air of mystery that surrounded her. But as David settled into this routine, he began to notice changes, subtle shifts in Lena's demeanor, fleeting glances toward the back of the bar where a group of men congregated. They weren't the typical patrons. Their hushed tones and furtive glances set David on edge. One evening, as the bar buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, David approached Lena. "You seem different lately," he said, concern lacing his voice. "Is everything okay?" Lena paused, her hands resting on the bar, and looked him in the eyes. "It's just been a busy week," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Nothing to worry about." But David couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He had seen that group of men too often, whispering among themselves, their eyes occasionally darting in Lena's direction. An unease settled in his stomach, the kind that hinted at danger lurking just beneath the surface. One night, David arrived at the Scarlet Room later than usual. The bar was quieter, the hum of conversation subdued. As he scanned the room, he spotted Lena talking to one of the men from the corner, a tall figure with an intimidating presence. David felt a flicker of jealousy and concern. "Lena, who's that guy?" he asked as she returned to the bar. Just a regular, she replied quickly, pouring his drink. But the tremor in her voice was unmistakable. He doesn't look like a regular, David pressed, his instincts kicking in. What does he want? Lena hesitated, her gaze flickering to the man before settling back on David. He's harmless. Just some business we need to discuss. Business? David repeated, his heart racing. What kind of business? Just drop it, David, Lena snapped, a flash of anger breaking through her usually calm demeanor. You don't understand what's going on here. David felt a pang of frustration. Then make me understand. You're pulling away from me and I don't know why. Lena softened at his words, her eyes searching his. It's complicated, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I promise, I'll explain everything soon. Just trust me. He wanted to trust her, but the nagging feeling of unease only grew stronger. David decided to dig deeper. As he left the bar that night, he noticed the tall man leaning against a car outside, waiting with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Who was he? And what was his connection to Lena? David contacted a friend from the police department, hoping to gather information. After a few discreet inquiries, he learned that the man was rumored to be connected to the mafia, a dangerous player in a world he had only glimpsed through Lena's eyes. Realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Lena was in deeper than he had ever imagined. Torn between his feelings for her and the danger she was entangled in, David knew he had to confront her. That night, he returned to the Scarlet Room with a heavy heart. As he stepped inside, the familiar sense enveloped him, but tonight, they felt different, tainted by the knowledge he had uncovered. When he spotted Lena behind the bar, he approached her with determination. We need to talk, he said firmly, his voice steady. Lena looked up, surprise flickering across her features. David, No more secrets, he interrupted, feeling the weight of their unspoken truths pressing down on them. I know who that guy is, and I won't let you get pulled into something dangerous. Lena's expression hardened, and for a moment David saw a glimpse of the wall she had built around herself. You don't know what you're talking about. Then help me understand, he pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. I care about you, Lena. Don't shut me out. For the first time, Lena hesitated. David could see the conflict in her eyes, torn between her life and the growing bond they shared. She exhaled deeply, her resolve softening. Meet me after closing. I'll tell you everything. As the bar emptied for the night, David's heart raced with anticipation and dread. The shadows of secrets loomed larger than ever, and he feared what Lena would reveal. Little did he know that the truth would change everything, pulling him deeper into a world he never asked to enter. The clock ticked slowly as David waited in the dimly lit bar, anxiety twisting in his stomach. The atmosphere of the Scarlet Room felt heavier tonight, the usual hum of laughter and chatter muted. As the last few patrons trickled out, he spotted Lena emerging from the back, her expression unreadable. Thanks for waiting, she said, her voice low. She moved closer, her presence both comforting and alarming. We need to talk. David nodded, his heart racing. I want to know everything. Who was that man? Lena sighed, glancing toward the door as if ensuring they were alone. His name is Victor. He's dangerous, connected to the mafia. David's breath caught in his throat. What does he want from you? He wants me to help him with a job. A big one, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. I'm not part of the mafia, but I've been doing some work for him on the side. It's complicated. Complicated? David echoed, disbelief flooding through him. You're in over your head. You can't trust someone like him. I know, Lena snapped, frustration breaking through her composed exterior. But I owe him. He helped me when I needed it. I didn't want to drag you into this. Then why didn't you tell me? David asked, his anger simmering beneath the surface. I could have helped. I didn't want you to worry, Lena said, her eyes filled with regret. I thought I could handle it alone. David shook his head, disbelief mixing with hurt. This isn't something you handle alone, Lena. You're risking your life. She stepped closer, her voice softening. I didn't want to put you in danger. I care about you, David, but Victor is powerful. If I don't cooperate, he won't hesitate to come after me, or you." David's heart raced. The thought of Lena being in danger sent a chill through him. "So what's your plan?" "I need to gather information for him. But I've been trying to find a way out," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep lying to you." "Then let me help," David urged, desperation creeping into his voice. "We can figure this out together." Lena hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but you need to be careful. If Victor suspects anything, he could turn violent." As they spoke, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. David felt a mix of determination and fear. He had to protect Lena, even if it meant stepping into a world of danger. They spent the next hour devising a plan, discussing ways to gather information while keeping Lena safe. As the clock ticked toward closing time, David realized how deeply he cared for her. He couldn't let her face this alone. Finally, as they prepared to leave, Lena looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for believing in me." David reached out, squeezing her hand. "We'll get through this together." But as they stepped out into the cool night air, the shadows of uncertainty loomed over them. David knew that the battle was far from over, and the real danger was just beginning. The following days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. David and Lena met regularly at the Scarlet Room, their conversations growing more urgent as they plotted how to navigate the treacherous waters surrounding Victor and the mafia. Each night, David felt the weight of Lena's secrets pressing on him, yet he remained determined to help her. One evening, Lena's demeanor shifted. She entered the bar with a tense expression, her eyes darting around as if she were being watched. David's heart sank at the sight of her. "Lena, what's wrong?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "Victor's getting impatient," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to give him something soon, or I don't know what he'll do." "Have you found anything?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is there any way we can turn this around?" Lena shook her head, frustration evident. "Every time I try to dig deeper, I get more tangled in his web. He's clever, David. He knows how to keep me in line." David's mind raced. What if we set a trap? We could turn the tables on him. Lena's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? That could put both of us in even more danger." "I can't just stand by and let him control you," David argued. "We need a plan. We need to expose him." Lena looked torn, her heart clearly at war with her mind. "If we do this, there's no going back. We could end up in serious trouble." David took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "I'm willing to take that risk if it means keeping you safe. You mean too much to me to let you face this alone." Lena studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "Okay, but we have to be careful. I'll gather what I can, but we need to meet at a secure place away from the bar." David nodded, adrenaline coursing through him. They spent the next few hours discussing potential locations, settling on an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place where they could strategize without prying eyes. As they left the bar, David noticed a figure lingering in the shadows across the street. The man's presence sent a jolt of anxiety through him, and he tightened his grip on Lena's hand. "Do you think we're being followed?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know," Lena replied, her eyes scanning the area. "Let's not take any chances. We should split up and meet at the warehouse." Reluctantly, David agreed, and they went their separate ways, each step heavy with unease. David's heart raced as he made his way to the warehouse, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. When he arrived, he took a moment to catch his breath. The building loomed in front of him, dark and foreboding. He felt a mixture of fear and determination as he stepped inside, the silence echoing around him. A few minutes later, Lena arrived, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "I didn't see anyone following me," she said, glancing around nervously. "But we need to hurry." They settled in, surrounded by old crates and the faint smell of damp wood. Lena pulled out her phone, showing David some documents she had secretly gathered about Victor's operations. "This is what I could find," she said, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed him the papers. "It's not much, but it might be enough to expose him." David scanned the documents, his mind racing as he pieced together the puzzle. "This is great, Lena. With this evidence, we can go to the police. We can—" Before he could finish, they heard a noise outside, a rustling that sent a chill down their spines. David's heart raced as he instinctively moved closer to Lena, protective instincts kicking in. "We have to hide," he whispered urgently. They ducked behind a stack of crates, holding their breath as footsteps approached. The door creaked open, and the light from the outside spilled into the dim warehouse. David's pulse quickened as he peered through the slats, and his heart sank at the sight of Victor and his men entering. "I know they're here." Victor's voice echoed through the warehouse, low and menacing. The atmosphere inside the warehouse grew tense as David and Lena crouched behind the crates, hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of Victor's men echoed in the dim space, their voices low and threatening. "Split up!" Victor ordered, his tone sharp. "They can't have gotten far." David's breath quickened as he realized the gravity of their situation. He exchanged a worried glance with Lena. "We need to find another way out," he whispered urgently. "Follow me," Lena whispered back, leading him toward a narrow corridor at the back of the warehouse. They moved quietly, hoping to evade Victor's men. As they crept down the corridor, David's mind raced with fear and anger. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. What had started as an innocent attraction had morphed into a deadly game, and he was determined to protect Lena at all costs. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the main room, followed by a shout. "They're over here!" "Run!" David urged, grabbing Lena's hand as they bolted down the corridor. They could hear the footsteps of Victor's men pursuing them, the sound growing louder as they approached. They turned a corner and stumbled into a small room filled with old machinery. David quickly scanned the area for anything they could use as a weapon or a means of escape. "Over there!" Lena pointed to a window high on the wall. "If we can get to that, we might be able to climb out." David nodded, but as they moved toward the window, they heard shouting from the corridor. Time was running out. "I'll boost you up," he said, lifting Lena as she reached for the ledge. Just as she grasped the edge, a loud bang echoed from the corridor. The door burst open and Victor's men poured in. "Lena, go!" David shouted, pushing her upward. "You have to get out!" Lena looked back. Fear etched on her face. "David, no! Just go! I'll hold them off!" he yelled, determination flooding his voice. With a final glance, Lena scrambled through the window and disappeared. David turned, heart racing as he faced the intruders. "Where's she going?" One of Victor's men sneered, stepping forward. "She's not your concern," David said, trying to sound brave, despite the fear coursing through him. Before he could react, the man lunged at him. David fought back, adrenaline fueling his movements as they exchanged blows. But just as David gained the upper hand, another man from Victor's crew struck him from behind, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Fool!" Victor's voice boomed from the shadows, and David felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. "You thought you could protect her?" David struggled to his feet, his vision blurred, but he stood his ground. "You won't get away with this," Victor smirked, the darkness in his eyes sending a chill down David's spine. "You're in over your head, kid. This is my territory." In a sudden movement, Victor's men closed in around David, and he knew he was outnumbered. With every ounce of strength, he fought back, but the odds were stacked against him. A fist connected with his jaw, and he stumbled backward, crashing into a pile of crates. Just then, there was a loud crash. As the door burst open again, Lena reappeared, wielding a metal pipe she had found. "Get away from him!" she screamed, charging at the men. "Lena, no!" David shouted, panic surging through him, but it was too late. In the chaos, Lena swung the pipe at one of the men, connecting solidly with his head. He collapsed to the ground, but the distraction only enraged the others. "Get her!" Victor roared, pointing at Lena. In the ensuing chaos, David's heart raced as he fought to reach her. He had to protect her, but in the struggle, he lost sight of her amidst the fray. The fight escalated, punches flying, shouts echoing in the enclosed space. Lena dodged a blow from another man, but in her attempt to escape, she stumbled. A loud shot rang out, and time seemed to freeze. David's heart sank as he turned to see Lena falling, a look of shock on her face. "No!" he screamed, rushing toward her as everything else faded away. Lena collapsed to the ground, her breath hitching as she gasped for air. The world around them blurred as David knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to assess the damage. "Lena, stay with me," he pleaded, fear clawing at his throat. "Help is coming!" But she looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain and fear. "David, He could feel the life slipping away from her, and he fought against the despair that threatened to consume him. The sound of Victor's men grew distant, as David focused only on Lena. "Hold on, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You can't leave me. Not like this." With her last breath, Lena whispered, "I love you," before her eyes fluttered shut. Time froze as David's world shattered around him. He cradled her in his arms, feeling helpless as the reality of their situation crashed over him. The fight continued around them, but all David could hear was the deafening silence that followed Lena's last words. He felt a mix of rage and grief, an overwhelming desire for revenge filling his heart. He would make Victor pay. He would not let Lena's sacrifice be in vain. The world around David felt like it was spinning out of control. The weight of Lena's lifeless body in his arms was a heavy reminder of the chaos they had found themselves in. As the sounds of the fight faded into the background, a deep sense of loss enveloped him. He had failed to protect her, and the realization cut deeper than any wound. With a surge of adrenaline, he carefully laid Lena down on the cold warehouse floor, his mind racing. He had to get her out of here. He had to find a way to honor her sacrifice. But the reality of the situation settled in as he glanced at the chaos around him. Victor's men were still there, and he couldn't let them find him vulnerable. "Get him!" Victor's voice roared through the air, snapping David back to the present. He bolted to his feet, fueled by rage and grief. The anger coursing through his veins was blinding. He would not allow Victor to win. Not now. Not after everything Lena had done for him. David quickly scanned the room, spotting a nearby metal pipe that had fallen during the chaos. He picked it up, gripping it tightly as he faced the approaching men. He wouldn't let Lena's death be in vain. He would fight for her. As the first man lunged at him, David swung the pipe with all his might, connecting with the man's ribs. The satisfying crack echoed in the warehouse, and the man crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. "Anyone else?" David shouted, adrenaline fueling his bravado. He could feel the tension in the air as the remaining men hesitated, assessing him. But Victor, seeing the shift in momentum, yelled, "Don't let him get away! Get him now!" The remaining men charged at David, and he fought fiercely, swinging the pipe with relentless determination. Each hit felt like a tribute to Lena, a way to channel his grief into action. But even as he fought back, he knew he couldn't hold out forever. Suddenly, he heard sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Hope surged through him. Help was on the way. But would it come in time? With a final push, David managed to knock out another man before turning to flee down the corridor. He had to get to safety before reinforcements arrived. As he sprinted through the maze of crates and shadows, his heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of what he had lost. He burst through a door at the end of the corridor and found himself in a dimly lit alleyway. The night air was cool against his flushed skin, and he paused for a moment to catch his breath. But he couldn't stop, not now. As he stepped into the street, the sound of police sirens grew closer, the flashing lights illuminating the darkened area. David knew he needed to find a way to warn them about Victor before it was too late. He quickly made his way to the nearest street corner, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Just as he reached the curb, a police car screeched to a halt beside him. The officers jumped out, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. "Sir, are you okay?" one of the officers asked, assessing David's disheveled appearance. "I need to talk to you. Victor is in that warehouse," David shouted, urgency in his voice. "He has men in there, and they're dangerous." The officers exchanged glances before one of them radioed for backup. "We'll check it out. Stay here." David shook his head, unwilling to be sidelined. "No, I need to come with you. It's not safe." Reluctantly, they allowed him to join them as they approached the warehouse. With the police backing him, David felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could finally bring Victor down. As they entered the warehouse, David felt the weight of what had just happened settle in again. He couldn't shake the image of Lena's face, the way her eyes had looked when she fell. The thought of vengeance surged in him, urging him to do everything he could to ensure that Victor and his men paid for their crimes. The officers moved cautiously through the dimly lit space, weapons drawn. David led them through the wreckage, his heart racing with each step. "Over here," he said, leading them to the room where Lena had fallen. The sight of her lifeless body still lying there sent a fresh wave of anguish crashing over him. "Call for medical assistance," one of the officers ordered, and David felt a surge of anger at the thought that it might be too late. As they waited for backup, David relayed everything he knew about Victor's operations, his eyes blazing with determination. They had to end this once and for all. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the main room, and David's heart dropped. "They're coming back," he warned the officers. The tension in the air thickened as they prepared to face the oncoming threat. David could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. He was about to confront the man responsible for Lena's death, and he would make sure that this time there would be no escape. The atmosphere in the warehouse was electric, charged with anticipation as David and the officers prepared for the impending confrontation. David's heart raced as he remembered Lena's last moments. Her sacrifice would not be forgotten. He was determined to ensure justice was served. The heavy footsteps echoed closer, and David's grip on the pipe tightened. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of apprehension and resolve. They knew they were facing Victor and his men, and the stakes had never been higher. "On my count," one of the officers whispered, their eyes trained on the door. 3, 2, 1. With a swift motion, they pushed through the door, guns drawn and ready. David followed closely, fueled by anger and a desperate need for closure. What awaited them was chaos. Victor's men, alerted by the sirens, were scrambling to regroup. The warehouse was a battleground, filled with shouts and the sounds of fists connecting with flesh. David dove into the fray, swinging the pipe wildly at the nearest man, the impact sending him sprawling to the ground. "Stop! Police!" one of the officers shouted, trying to restore order. But chaos reigned, and the atmosphere turned into a whirlwind of fists, shouting, and the clattering of weapons. David fought alongside the officers, adrenaline coursing through him as he pushed through the crowd. He needed to find Victor. He needed to face him. In the midst of the chaos, David spotted Victor standing at the far end of the warehouse, a dark figure amid the chaos. The sight of him sent a rush of rage through David. This was the man responsible for everything: the death, the deception, and Lena's sacrifice. "Victor!" David yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Victor turned, a smirk playing on his lips as he met David's gaze. "Ah, David," Victor sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "I see you've come to play." David charged at Victor, the pipe raised high. "This ends now!" As they clashed, the air crackled with tension. David swung the pipe with all his strength, but Victor was quick, dodging the blow and retaliating with a swift punch that landed squarely on David's jaw. The force sent him stumbling back, but the pain only fueled his determination. "You think you can take me down?" Victor laughed, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "You're nothing without your precious Lena." The mention of her name ignited a fire within David. He had lost too much already, and he wouldn't let Victor mock her memory. With renewed vigor, he lunged forward, swinging the pipe again. This time, it connected, knocking Victor off balance. "Get him!" one of the officers shouted, closing in on Victor. But Victor was a skilled fighter, and he quickly regained his footing. David was relentless, each swing of the pipe driven by grief and fury. He could feel the tide turning, the officer's backup making a significant difference. Together, they pressed Victor back, cornering him against a stack of crates. "Your reign of terror is over," David shouted, feeling a rush of triumph. But Victor wasn't done yet. With a swift movement, he grabbed a knife from his belt and lunged toward David. The officers shouted, but David was already moving, instinct taking over as he sidestepped the attack. David's heart raced as he grappled with Victor, the knife glinting dangerously in the dim light. They struggled, each man trying to gain the upper hand. In a final burst of strength, David twisted Victor's arm, forcing the knife from his grip. It clattered to the ground, and David seized the moment. With one last effort, David tackled Victor to the ground, pinning him down. The officers rushed forward, quickly securing Victor in handcuffs. "It's over, Victor," David panted, his heart racing. "You're done." Victor glared at David, fury burning in his eyes. "You think this is the end? You have no idea what you're up against." But David was too exhausted to care. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a heavy sense of relief. The nightmare was finally coming to an end. As the officers led Victor away, David felt a wave of emotions wash over him. Grief, anger, and a flicker of hope. He had avenged Lena's death, but the victory felt hollow without her by his side. Lena would never be forgotten. Her memory would fuel his fight against the darkness. David managed a weak smile, but his heart ached. "I just wish she was here." The officer nodded, understanding the depth of David's loss. "She was a brave woman. We'll make sure her story is told." After the showdown at the warehouse, David stood outside the police station, grappling with the weight of his grief. "Hey, you all right?" Mark, his friend from the precinct, approached, concern etched on his face. "You did great last night. We couldn't have taken Victor down without you." "Thanks, Mark, but it doesn't feel like enough," David replied, forcing a smile. Mark nodded, understanding. "Lena wouldn't want you to dwell on it. We have to keep fighting for what she stood for." The mention of Lena reignited David's determination. "What's going to happen to Victor?" he asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "He's in custody, but he's a slippery one. We'll have to keep an eye on him," Mark said, his expression serious. David was grateful for the support of the police force, but the darkness of Lena's absence weighed heavily on his heart. "I need to do something more," he murmured. "Like what?" Mark asked, intrigued. "I want to start a foundation in Lena's name," David declared, "to help victims of crime and support those who can't fight back." Mark's eyes widened. "That's a powerful idea. I'll help you get it off the ground." With Mark's support, David poured his heart into the foundation, collaborating with officers and sharing Lena's story. Each meeting felt like a step closer to her, and with every success, he honored her legacy. The grand opening of the foundation was filled with people from the community. David stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. He saw familiar faces, Mark, the officers, and many affected by crime. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "This foundation is dedicated to Lena, a brave woman who fought against the darkness in our community." As he spoke, he felt her presence. He poured his heart into the speech, sharing stories of Lena's kindness and bravery. The crowd listened intently, some with tears in their eyes. David threw himself into the foundation, organizing self-defense classes to empower victims. With renewed determination, David continued to fight for a safer community, determined to honor Lena's memory and ensure justice would prevail.